personal trainer. The panel is about reconsidering political trust and distrust in contemporary European democracies. This panel focuses on how political trust and distrust function within democratic systems. It examines how citizens evaluate the trustworthiness of institutions, political leaders, and democratic processes, and how these evaluations shape political behavior, compliance, participation, and support for democracy. The discussion will address both trust and distrust as meaningful political attitudes and explore how they relate to accountability, responsiveness, and legitimacy. The prestigious panelists here will reflect on the conceptual foundations of trust and distrust, their relationship to democratic legitimacy, and the implications for research, theory, and the future public debate. The speakers are Professor Christian Welzel from Leuphana University of Lüneburg in Germany. He is the National Director of our project for Germany, Vice President of the World Wealth Survey, and a leading scholar in this field. Professor Radoslav Markowski is from the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Poland, and the leading researcher, amongst many things, on elections. Professor Céline Bilot from Sciences Po Grenoble, University of Grenoble-Alpes in France. She is the leading member of the qualitative research group in our grant and also of the French team. Professor Claudio Tufis is from the University of Bucharest in Romania. He's the national leader of the project in Romania. And Damian Gusek, I don't know the title, from the University of Silesia in Katowice in Poland. Welcome to all of you. In order to connect the comparative data, the theoretical perspectives, and empirical experiences, we would like to have the conversation around three guiding questions. First, what exactly do trust, trustworthiness, and distrust measure in democratic life? Second, why do they vary across contexts in turbulent political times? And finally, what institutional and communicative practices sustain warranted trust, trustworthiness while accommodating legitimate distrust. So that's the structure, and we will now begin. And the first speaker is Professor Christian Welzel. And Christian, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about virtuous and vicious differentiation in institutional trust. So I'm talking about institutional trust, not social trust or interpersonal trust. Institutional trust. One first premise of mine is to say that we have to stop to talk about institutional trust in it by itself. We need to partition it or to compartmentalize it into its beneficial and detrimental forms. And I have a suggestion for that, and this has been communicated with Pippa up and down. It's basically the similar idea, and I will explain a little bit here what I mean with that. Why do I think that we should not consider institutional trust in just an unqualified manner and just measure it in the raw form as we usually do it and then compare average numbers across countries? It's not very telling, especially not if we are interested in the question of in what way institutional trust is beneficial for liberal democracy. This is now an imaginary graph. I could show it, but just imagine you have on the horizontal axis, you measure institutional trust. On the left-hand side, you have countries where the percentage of people who express high institutional trust is low, and you go more to the right, and the percentages get higher and higher and higher. On the vertical axis, on the y-axis, you have a measure of democracy. Let's say it's Wiedem's liberal democracy score. And you will see there is not at all any linear relationship, but what you see is a curvilinear relationship that is U-shaped. You will see on the upper left part a couple of outright closed dictatorships in the world where trust is, institutional trust among the citizens as they express it, is very high. You will find in this group of countries China, Singapore, and some of the Gulf monarchies. And then you go to the middle part of trust, and then it drops, and then it goes up again, and on the upper right end of the U, you will find mostly the Scandinavian countries, or more generally speaking, countries in Protestant northwestern Europe. So trust in it by itself is not very telling about democratic conditions, neither as a cause nor as a symptom. And therefore we have to think about how we part it up into the beneficial and the detrimental part. One thing that got me in this direction is a book. The title is Hard White: The Mainstreaming of Racism in 20th Century US America. The authors are Richard Fording and Sanford Schramm. And they came up with a very interesting scale. They were looking for the Trump voters, more generally speaking, voters of right-wing populist parties. And they developed a psychological scale that measures what they call, quote, cognition need, unquote. What this scale does, it measures how much people, when they make decisions, also in everyday life, not only in politics, like whom you marry, which house you buy, how much people just follow their intuition, just their gut feeling. Or on the opposite polar end, you would have people who base every decision taking an Excel sheet, making a list of the pros and cons, and making a rational balancing act, and only then make the decision. The interesting part about this was that Trump voters are notoriously low on cognition need. Notoriously low on cognition need. And you can imagine what consequences this also has. This is the type of trust that Pippa mentioned, which is where the trust that is expressed or the distrust that is expressed is off, untied, largely untied from cognitive, rational processes. You see it also, it's also a phenomenon why right-wing populists always get easily away with lies. Because if your supporters have low cognition need, they never double check. So they don't go in the process of fact checking. So they can lie, and the voters, their supporters, they don't even realize it. So this is why they don't lose support with being untrustworthy. So if we have expressions of trust or distrust that are off, uncoupled from cognitive processes, I think what we get is either cynical distrust, so people who distrust anyways without checking, and in the other case you get ignorant trust, so people who trust anyways. I mean, with populist voters you have it in the two versions in one voter, because these voters distrust what is called the establishment, just generically, and trust the populists no matter what they do. And this is a form of trust we really don't need in liberal functioning democracies. What we need, of course, is that the trust or distrust, both of them, should be coupled with a cognitive process. Exactly as Pippa pointed out. I have slightly different terminologies, but she says if the trust is deserved because the institutions work kind of properly, and the voter perceives that and expresses trust, this is rational trust. If the institutions do not work so properly, the voter perceives that, and the evaluation is distrust, and then you have rational distrust. And these are, both of them are beneficial, because rational trust means that in a system that functions quite well, you will have the deserved compliance in the electorate for what the elites and the politicians are doing. If it's rational distrust, that will be a society where people have expectations, they are not fulfilled, and they recognize it, and then this will be a source of pressure on those in power to improve. So this could be a source of democratization pressures, for instance. Now, this is pretty much in line with what Pipper has been portraying or presenting. We go a step further, and this is where our nuance is in. So we were asking ourselves, what are the processes that make those rational forms of trust or distrust more prevalent? So how do we get more people into a situation where their trust judgment is the result of a cognitive process? And here we got back to older concepts that have been introduced by Ronald Inglehart and also Russell J. Dalton. Cognitive mobilization. It's a slightly forgotten concept in political science. It is, of course, about education, but it is much more than that. What we see in our data, and we did a couple of global analyses, is that where people or populations are in the demographic transition process of falling fertilities, paralleled by rising schooling rates, this is a powerful engine of getting emancipative values on the floor or on the surface. So where these processes, countries where these processes are far advanced, emancipative values are growing fast and are at a high level. And now what we did in our analyses, if we can go to the third of my slides where you only see this conceptual picture, rosy and bluish, right? So you have kind of a virtuous and a vicious dynamic. And what we did, we partitioned the trust that people express into their institutions and put it into two parts. One part that is value-free. This is basically the residual in institutional trust that people express that is uncoupled, untied, loose of emancipative values. So this is part A. And then we looked at part B. The other trust component is the one that is exactly predicted, so coupled with people's emancipative values. So we get a distinction between value-free institutional trust and value-based institutional trust. And then we used them as separate components to predict institutional qualities in a country, including liberal democracy, but also rule of law, law enforcement, absence of corruption. And the outcome is very clear. Value-free component of trust, the value-free component of trust has not only no impact on those institutional performance indicators, the impact is strongly negative. And only the value-based component of the trust has positive effects, and they are quite strong. Now, of course, correlation is not causation, so we can think about the mechanisms and what is the cause and what is the effect, but it's quite clear that a symbiotic relationship between institutional trust and democracy and other institutional performance indicators you only get to see if you focus on the beneficial form of trust and not the detrimental one. And the beneficial one is based on emancipative values. I think we can show that quite clearly in our analysis. So, key conclusion, let's stop talking about institutional trust without further qualifications, and let's think about this is just one method. There's other possibilities to cut the cake, but to distinguish virtuous from vicious forms of institutional trust.
Thank you very much, Professor Christian Welzel. And the next speaker is Radoslav Markowski from the Polish Academy of Sciences in Poland. Radek, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Actually, I have two caveats. One is that trust is what I will going to present, only one of the indicators of political legitimacy in two projects which we which I want to present here. Do you see on the screen 3 books, Oxford University Press? These, so the first project is. Yeah, well, no, I'm fine here as long as, can I change, do I change now to 1 book? Is it? Okay, so I can do that, okay. So this book, especially the one that 2016, How Europeans View and Evaluate Democracy, and this, the 2025, this year's book, 10 years later, edited by Hans-Peter Krisi and Monika Ferrin, is part of, and also I will refer to my article in Politics and Governance this year from another project, which is Horizon Europe project called Authoritarianisms and Liberal Democratic Responses in Europe. So the major issue here is, what I want to say is to point to the following. There are truly, and this research of the European Social Survey, let me remind you, it's over 100,000 Europeans in the 2 waves and 30 plus countries. So what we clearly see in Europe is that different models of democracy in terms of views of citizens, normative expectations towards what democracy should look like are in place. Obviously, the most cherished and popular is the liberal model, the liberal package, we know it. But, and I'm happy with this because there was a long debate in 2010 whether we include the kind of idea that democracy should also be about redistribution and social democratic vision of democracy, and it's there. Then we have direct and populist model of democracy. All of them exist. Now, I want to save you the details of that. A very sophisticated analysis, especially in the second book, are there. But the crucial point, what we see is that democracies are, these models of democracies are substitutive relationships with each other and not alternatives. That is to say, majority of Europeans support and see democracy as a liberal democracy, and on top of that, they expect the social democratic, populist, and direct democracy. Now, the very interesting thing is that the liberal model is sufficient for Western and Northern Europeans. They are fine with the liberal model alone. And as you move eastwards and southeastwards, the democracy becomes more demanding. The Easterners and Southerners want also direct democracy, popular democracy, and social democratic redistribution as elements of democracy. And this is the first step, that this is where the problems start. The expectation towards democracies in some parts of Europe is too high to be met. Between 2002 and 2022, there is little change. And if anything, there is more support, astonishingly, after the crisis, after the migrant crisis, for the liberal model, not for the redistributive or populist, as we would expect. And even more importantly, what we were truly surprised is that political losers, and this comes this should be a prize to Adam Przeworski's definition of democracy, and I think Anderson's book, By Losers' Consent, that persuade us that democracy functions as long as losers are accepting the rules of the game. You know the famous Przeworski's definition of democracy. This is an institutionalized uncertainty, stable rules of the game and unstable results. If it is the other way around, we might be in Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan, with all due respect for their cuisine, but not democracy, right? So I think this is very important. And then in some countries, and let me show the graph here. So this, I think, this is what I've said. There are other results that would probably be important to discuss, but no time. Sorry, this is somehow delayed. I'm pressing the thing and it doesn't work. Let me show the graph for a moment, where we also, and this is along the kind of Dahrendorfian spirit, you know. Ralph Dahrendorf, once upon a time, in one of the latest interviews with him, said something like this: look, the reality is complex and very, very complicated. We social scientists should be prepared for that. If somebody comes and says it is simple, then it is the first step to authoritarian and illiberal solutions. And what I want to say here is that when we analyze in this two waves of our research the attitude towards how important it is to live in a democracy. Okay, it could be more complicated, but let us take these two questions. And at the same time, the horizontal axis is it acceptable to have a leader that is above the law in your country? What you see, I would have expected that, you know, maybe there are 2 or 3 countries that are appreciative of this leader above the law, but most of Europeans would be in favor of having true democracy without leader. But it's not true. You see, most of the countries are somewhere in between. Netherlands, Ireland, Estonia, Poland, etc., etc. There are those like Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, and Lithuania that are clearly in the camp of those who are pretty much allowing for an authoritarian leader above the law. But other than that, personally, I call it a shampoo theory of democracy, 2 in 1, you know. Europeans seem to say the following: well, of course, we are for the liberal model, yes, separation of powers, but why not having, in addition, a liberal that is above the law, just in case, yeah? Maybe it would be nice to have him. And here you have a graph which shows the level in particular countries. Since we are in Poland, let me tell you that Poland in 22 was placed between France and the United Kingdom and Germany, rather than with this enfant terribles of Europe. This is the other project. Is well, let me make the long story short. So the other project, this authoritarianisms in plural and liberal democratic responses in Europe, was aimed at the following. First of all, we wanted to see what are the different kinds of alternatives to liberal democracies, both at the regime level and as a set of ideas and ideologies. I was the one who insisted that populism is too broad a basket. You know, I mean, everything is, you throw everything that is nasty for democracy into the basket of populism. So Putin is populism, AfD is populist, Bolsonaro is populist. It doesn't make sense, right? So we invented that we should look at 3 things: populism, illiberalism, and authoritarianism. I have no time to define them, how we did play with it, but I will show something in a minute how empirically it turned out to be, how complicated, and that de facto there are different models of populism, illiberalism, and authoritarianism. But one of the, actually this was my interest in this project, is to see, and I was looking into Hungarian case in particular and comparing it with Poland in 2022, 23, 24, to see whether we can, you know, there was this famous Linz and Stepan dictum, which they, in 1996, said that, well, we should look at whether there are consolidated new democracies as the only game in town. Now, are bur, yeah? Is there a chance to talk of any of these backsliding, decaying democracies as consolidated illiberal regimes? And of course, the first candidate in Europe was Hungary. So I looked at whether this makes sense. We also assume that between populism, illiberalism, and authoritarianism, there is a sequence which is not deterministic nor universal, but certainly it everybody's, and we make the distinction between populist as opposition and contesting the power, and populists in power, which actually are not anymore populists. They are already illiberals or authoritarians. So everywhere around in Europe, whenever dismantling of democracy starts, it starts basically with populist ideas. Why? Well, because it's cheap and easy. And it's easy to say, elites are corrupted, we are one nation, and blah, 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 like this, yeah? Once they put a hand on power and they try to dismantle the institutional infrastructure, then it is more demanding, it is, etc., etc. And actually, of course, we assume that reverse developments happen, and it depends on the public reaction, on external forces and economic context. So to make the long story short, what we discovered in this, and we are currently writing a lot of pieces, publications on that, is that not only we distinguish populism, illiberalism, and authoritarianism empirically, as we have planned it, but within those we see that populism has two versions. One is anti-elite simplism, something that is one factor, and the other is kind of majoritarian Manichaeanism. Illiberalism uncovers at least three times state parochialism, cultural traditionalism, and nativism, which are, well, they correlate, but they are definitely different entities ontologically. And finally, authoritarianism discloses two forms. One is clearly political and one is social. And of course, then we have three indicators of, we are working on it, so I am open to criticism, but three indicators, three operationalization of political legitimacy. One is along the lines of famous Lipset dictum from 1959, that trust in institutions is something that indicates political legitimacy, but in this instance, in order to be capable of tracing whether there is consolidation of illiberal regimes, we distinguish between non-partisan institutions such as legal system and police and partisan governments. And if you look at this support, trust in these institutions, they differ a lot in particular electorates of particular parties. The second is my invention, already 25-year-old, which is along another indication of political legitimacy, is something that is satisfaction. It is along Easton's ideal about diffuse political support. That is, it is net satisfaction with democracy, that is, satisfaction of democracy which is decontaminated from the effect of satisfaction with the government and satisfaction with economic performance. As you know, in the literature, there is this broad assumption that you can be confused by successful economic performance as democratic legitimacy, which is not there. And the third is importance of certain normative elements of liberal democracies. And again, to make the long story short, I am not going to entertain you with this table, and there are many other tables, but probably the most important thing is that only populism as anti-elitism, illiberalism as nativism are the two phenomena that are unconducive to all four models of political legitimacy. With other, it differs. So I leave it open for the debate. It might be the problem on the side of the dependent variable, of course, but equally it might be that these notions of particular manifestations of alternatives to liberal democracies matter. So finally, absolutely finally, my dictum would be, apart from Dahrendorfian, the reality is complex, avoid simplism, also avoid large quantifiers. That is, there is no black and white relationship between liberal democracy and especially populism. In many instances, people, and especially we also have conjoint experiments there, and we see that those who are in favor of, if Peter Mayer was here, he would say popular, or Nadia Urbinati, they would say popular democracy is still a democracy. It's not a clearly liberal democracy, but there is more room for the voice of the people instead of elites, etc., etc. So this is one thing. Secondly, there are even those who can somehow manufacture to look positively on authoritarian leader above the law and liberal democracy. That is the second thing. Secondly, democracies differ, very much differ. And of course, they also differ in terms of their clear-cut shortcomings. The reasons why illiberals are successful are partly due to what malfunctions in democracies, and this is also in our project. So alternatives are plural, consolidation of illiberal regimes. Of course, more time and cases are needed, but I think that there is a comparison of Hungary and Poland. I can elaborate on that later on. That shows that, well, currently in Hungary there seems to be a change, but for many, many years, these two examples were by pundits and public intellectuals were mixed together. They were completely different examples of malfunctioning of liberal democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Markowski. The next speaker is Professor Céline Belot from University of Grenoble Alpes and Sciences Po. Céline is a co-director of the French team in our project. Please.
Yes? Okay. So as Christian told you, in TRUEDEM I was responsible of the qualitative group for the collection of the data sets. And we collected more than 300 interviews with political leaders, policymakers, and CSO actors. And we did as well, so in 10 countries, in 10 European countries. And we did as well 21st focus groups, which gathered 177 citizens, senior and young, urban and rural, with different level of education in 6 countries. So what I wanted to do here is to talk a little bit of this, what we have with the data, knowing that first, I was asked to be short, and second, we are just at the beginning of the analysis. So these are tentative answers to the question which you asked us. So the idea of such a qualitative data set was not to measure trust or trustworthiness. We're not able to do that with qualitative data. But to take a step aside, to take seriously the fact that political trust is primarily relational, and the result of a complex web of relationships with different actors, expectations, and perceptions, playing a role in defining trust towards the authorities, the political institution, and the regime as a whole. And you see here in the background, there's the Eastern frame of the political system. We just build out data sets in order for them to mirror one another. So now what do they tell us about trust that we have already been able to see? First, as trust is a two-sided relationship. Maybe we tend to forget that, but in democracy, for the regime to be legitimate and function, people need to trust political actors, but political actors need as well to trust citizens. And that was quite interesting in our data, is that political actors, when they talk about trust, they used most of the time words acknowledging trust as a dynamic and circular relation. They talk about, they say it's a currency, they say it's vital, as something that is circulate, but without mostly always fully considering what this really means for their activity as political actors. Some, however, do, and I'm just quoting, and there will be my only quote tonight, but a quote from a woman political legislator, local level Sweden. What she tells us is, during election, when we are out taking to vote, you hear what issues matter to them, and it helps guide us in our work. There's a mutual understanding. I need to feel confident when making decisions, knowing what I campaign on and ensuring I stay true to those promises. So our unfinished work, because we're really working on it, is to work on these two sides' relationship with the idea that for political trust to exist, there must be a mutual agreement on the rule of good governance, the perception of the good citizen and the good political actors by both political actors, citizens, and CSO. Let's say, if citizens expect first the political actor to be ethic keeper, and the political actor believe themselves to be first problem solver, even if politicians do a good job as a problem solver, it might not be enough to build trust. And that's exactly what a former talker was this morning said. The former mayor, former member of the European Parliament, and a member of Team Europe Direct. He said exactly that. So if political actors believe good citizens are principally voters, and they are using other forms of participations political actors find illegitimate, this again is a misfit, which might nurture trust. So we already identify a few of such misfits. We identify, for example, actor using the same word but not meaning the same thing. Fairness, for example, is really present in lots of our interviews. Political actors consider but they're not used at all by political actors and citizens in the same way. Political actors consider a political system to be fair when it applies to the same rule for all citizens, impartiality. Citizens consider a political system to be fair when it takes care of all citizens equally and fight inequalities. That's something else. And so if you don't understand that, maybe you're not able to solve that. We have as well actors not fully agreeing at what are main norms of a political system to enforce when considering trust between the list you presented earlier, Christian. And in France, for example, because we haven't done that on all countries yet, but we find that citizens tend to discuss more integrity, fairness, and accountability, whereas political elites discuss more transparency, integrity, and accountability. You see, there's a difference in the term. So, citizens discuss fairness when discussing norm of trustworthiness. Political elites, they do at some part, but not much. And the level they talk about it is different. And CSO, again, they have a different view as well. They discuss about accountability, integrity, and transparency. So our aim is to map all this. In fact, to map all the misfits between these different actors, and to try to focus on, where are the misfits, and we hope by this to understand even better what nurture trust and distrust in our democracies. And I have answers to your third questions, which is what shall be done, but I think maybe we can discuss that further on.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Celine. The next speaker is Professor Tufis from the University of Bucharest in Romania, the team leader of our project for Romania. Claudio, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Listening to you and especially to Professor Markowski, I just remember that in addition to Romania and the United States, Poland is the third country which contributed to my intellectual development. Your presentation reminded me of 25 years ago when I was a master's student at IFISPAN, and I was talking to Professor Mokshitsky about democratization in Romania, the kind of approach that you had. Also, part of what you said, this distinction between, this interpretation that Eastern European countries have somehow a more demanding understanding of democracy. I kind of saw that in a piece I wrote about 10 years ago based on World Value Survey data, and I was looking at the relationship between support for democracy and other alternatives of democracy, social democratic components included, and in Eastern European countries you could see a positive relationship. They were going hand in hand, and as you were going towards the western part of the continent, the relationship was changing, non-significant in Central Europe and then becoming negative in Western European countries. But I'm going to skip over those, and I'm just going to speak very briefly about where I think the issue of trust is going to go in the next maybe 10, 15, 20 years, based on what we've learned in our project. So we do have a lot of findings, interesting findings in the research that we've done over these 3 years. However, the moment when we wrote this project and we applied with it was 2022, when the artificial intelligence tools were just starting to become available at the global level to everyone. And since then, I think we are seeing the beginning of, I don't know if we should say a revolution. I don't like the word revolution when it comes to this, but a significant change in how people are going to think about what's happening. So trust for me, and not only for me, it's linked to risk and uncertainty. It's a tool for reducing uncertainty and risk. And the way I see these artificial intelligence tools developing over the next 10, 15 years, they are going to actually increase a lot of the uncertainty that population, citizens have with respect to pretty much everything in their everyday lives. We don't know right now what's going to happen with the education system, how our university is going to look like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now. What are the new jobs going to be like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now? So there's going to be an increased level of uncertainty, which means that for the regular citizens, I believe there's going to be a sort of muddied perception of the future. We don't know what's going to happen. At the same time, the subjects of our trust, the objects of our trust, the institutions, I'm referring only to institutional trust, again, they're going to have similar problems because they're going to be faced with uncertainties that they haven't dealt with before, and they're not going to be able to know exactly how to react to those. So I expect for the next 10, 15, 20 years to see a sort of shift in the way both citizens and the institutions that are the objects of our trust are going to react to new challenges in the societies. And the result of that is that probably I would expect citizens to have increasing demands. So in a way, linking back to what you're saying, in a way, I would expect even citizens in Western European countries to have increased demands on the institutions, on the democratic system, and at the same time, the institutions themselves, I expect them to not be able to respond as fast as possible or as fast as we are demanding it from these institutions to our demands. The result, of course, in my perception, is going to be a crisis of trust, because we will have to adapt to this new relationship that is going to be co-created in our relationship between citizens and institutions. So we will have to adapt to a new reality, and that one, to me, it looks like it's going to lead, at least in the short and medium term, to a decline in the level of institutional trust. And of course, I'm coming back, given that we are in Poland, I like to pay homage to some of the Polish sociologists, so I'm going to bring into discussion Piotr Sztomka. We know that if trust is not going to work, we need to find some substitutes of trust that are going to work. And in his book on trust, it's already 20-something years old, almost 30 years old, but I still think it's relevant. He defines some of these substitutes of trust, and I think they're going to be relevant again for the upcoming period of time. So given that we don't have a lot of time, I will stop here and maybe intervene and explain more if people are going to have questions about this. Thank you.
Many thanks, Claudio. The next speaker, can you switch it off? Yeah. The next speaker is Dr. Damian Gutzek from the University of Silesia in Katowice. Please.
Yes, thank you for having me here. So my perspective is slightly different because I'm presenting the media variable, I would say, as a media scholar. Last year we started a PodTrust project. It's a new initiative sponsored by Transatlantic Platform. So we've there is a collaboration in between Silesia, Sheffield, Audiencia NAN, so there's also France, and on the Anglo-American side there's also Ottawa. We started with this basic distinction in between trust, distrust, and mistrust, which is one of the most important issues in terms of media variable, or the usage of media and social media platforms. And we wanted to check in the project, which is called PodTrust, what's the potential of optimizing political digital contact. So whether politicians are ready to use digital platforms and different types of digital contact to actually reduce the tension, increase the trust in between different parties, and among them, especially those who are representing minorities or underrated or highlighted background groups. And because the project is of a mixed research, so there are survey components, and we used Cevipo's data from France from the last 2024 Sciences Po Paris survey, and we compared that with one of our surveys that we conducted just before the setup of the project. And we checked whether this media and platform variable is important in terms of trust, distrust, and so on. And the funny thing is that we saw that in general there's no statistic significance on this kind of variable in relation to satisfaction with democracy, different types of emotions, and of course trust in institutions. When we tried to check in between platforms, because the connection in between specific type of users and the media usage is yet to come. So we already checked specific platforms, media platforms, and whether those are actually affecting this distrust atmosphere and so on. So the most highlighted in the project comparison in between Poland and France, that there were some turbulences and elections in our survey in Poland in between 2022 and the French 2024, showing that there are some options to check whether the illiberal conditions are also affecting those. There is a lot of thinking about radical right position, not populism, but definitely those illiberal conditions. And what we saw that, of course, in Poland there's no option that both media and digital platforms, they are not important in terms of increasing, decreasing trust. But in France, the closer to 2024, the more important it's becoming this issue of distrust and increase of distrust, especially in times of those messaging apps that are used by users to exchange information, pieces of information. TikTok, WhatsApp, so those are potential problems. And we see that there is another issue, that the position of politically engaged media outlets or traditional media outlets. It's also an issue for the study, having in mind that there were no position to that in France, but in Poland, those who were promoting politically engaged public television after the positive mobilization of society and the democratic change after the elections, those they became highly distrustful, and they lost this trustworthiness to political institution and new government. And I guess that might be the starting point from my position. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have an exchange between the panelists. You can talk to each other, you can complain about each other, or ask questions to each other.
Can we shout at each
other? Shout at each other. Everything is possible. Please, there's a microphone. Do you want to talk, respond to some of your colleagues, or should we make it open for the audience?
Make it open.
Okay. Okay. Now, the panel has spoken, and now it's up to you to ask questions and address the panel.
I guess I will try to ask a general question that will
be applicable to all the presenters, but I would like to start with you, Claudio, right? With the changes, the erosion of trust is possible, right? What comes into that? Is it distrust? Is it skepticism? I guess I want to pull your tongue a little bit on that. How do you see that developing going forward? Because you're right. I mean, initially the promise of social media in general and then of artificial intelligence would be quick access to reliable information, and yet that's very much propelled also by distrust. I mean, I'm getting the answers I want to see. Eventually, I don't trust the very tools I was supposed to rely on in my social everyday life.
Okay, so to answer right now, yeah, sure. The way I see it, we already have the experience of the last 25 years since the internet came into our lives. So I see the internet as the first phase, and now the artificial intelligence part is the second one. And the reason why I have these rather negative expectations about the future has to do with the fact that over the last 25 years, we certainly did not, as a society, not me or you, but generally, we haven't learned yet how to distinguish between the various sources of information. Basically, we have a mountain of information thrown at us, and we have difficulties, again, as a society, to understand exactly which ones are valid information and which ones to accept and interpret and use in our reasoning. And given that we already have this sort of difficulty, the appearance of these artificial intelligence tools that are going to, I think they're going to actually increase the problem, because there's going to be additional information coming out, and in addition to not being sure to understand which one is correct, which is incorrect, now we have an additional layer, which is of not knowing whether it's information that comes from a human or it comes from a machine. One might argue, of course, it doesn't matter, because even behind the machine there is somebody who created the message that is put forward. But in addition to the message, the content of the message, there's also the fact that you might have fakes, deep fakes, and all of the others that are going to make it a lot more difficult for regular political actors to do their jobs. So my perspective is then that we will be flooded with additional problems of interpreting information, and that is going to make it difficult for the citizens to know who to trust, what to trust anymore. And that's why before we get to the next step, I think we're going to see a decline in trust. What's happening with this decline in trust, I can only guess, and we've seen the experience of Hungary, of Poland, we've seen the experience of Romania, Slovakia, all of the countries in our part of the world have gone to some version of this problem, and in most cases the outcome has been rather negative for democracy, and I expect that's going to become a more significant issue in Romania over the next 3 or 4 years. In Slovakia, it's already a problem right now. So we'll see how we deal. But the main point I think that I'm trying to make is that we are at a crossroads where we don't have the tools, again, as a society, to understand what's happening and how to deal with that. It's just a feeling at the moment. I'm not sure. I mean, we've not studied this particular topic. It's a feeling, and at the same time, I would say a call for additional studies to be done that are going to. So in a way, I think we need to come back and reconstruct our understanding of what democracy is and all of the other mechanisms, which brings me back to this idea that we will need political theorists and philosophers to come back and reconstruct the concepts, taking into account this new way of creating information and disseminating amongst ourselves.
Thank you very much. And maybe 2 questions, and I'll give back the microphone, but for Professor Markowski and Professor Welzel. First of all, very surprising about the liberal democracy demand in Scandinavia. I don't know if that's part of your project that you're currently working on, but do you feel, is it possible, for example, that the third wave of democratization for countries in Central Eastern Europe created this awareness that we're in a race and we're behind in that race, and part of solution was supposed to be democracy, but democracy also caused many issues, inflation, unemployment, and in people's mind, do they see that social democracy redistribution as a further answer to that question? And in Scandinavia, they see that the liberal democracy delivers. That's why that's the baseline over there. I'm just curious about what do you think is going on with that? And for Chris, very interesting observation about the cognitive need for the Trump voters. Do you, or the lack of, right? The lack of, in many ways, as you said, this is an expression of irrational trust. Is that an acquired ability, I don't know, feature, or is that more innate? I'm just wondering, you know, how we all have these heuristics to optimize our thinking, right? But if it's such a low level, it certainly matters for the quality of democracy and evaluation of options that are available. I'm just wondering, how is that process occurring in those voters, if you could speak potentially to that?
That's a very good question, thank you. Well, in this project of the European Social Survey, what we have is that, well, one of the fundamental assumptions, we've said that we don't ask these simple general questions about attitudes towards democracy, but we disentangle democracy into 20+ dimensions, like rule of law, free and fair elections, accountability, you name it, freedom of media, etc., etc. And we have two batteries of questions. One is about views, normative expectations, what should democracy look like, what is important for democracy, and the second, the same elements of democracy are asked, how satisfied are you in your country with the performance in this respect? So, I didn't have time to elaborate on that, but there is a very tricky or even fishy relationship between the two. So one of the things, for instance, Czech case is always very hard to interpret in many respects. But for instance, in social democratic redistributive things, they say they are not really, in terms of normative expectation, they don't expect from democracy this. And why is this? Well, because they have it. Yeah? It's a classical demand-supply thing. The democracies that perform well on certain dimensions, their citizens do not expect that much from the... So probably, and there is more to that, but the interaction between the two is very important. Probably as we learn what happens to democracies, you know, I don't know whether this ontology of time is always a problem. So how much time do you need in order to have citizens who are prepared to, I'm sorry, I'm critical of the sovereign, but let me take this chance. Well, many citizens in our countries are simply not prepared. We had a project of the Polish NCN, which was called Political Knowledge of Poles, conducted in 2017, 18, and so, and probably you're looking for a book from this project. There is no book because we are afraid to write it, you know, because the sovereign will bash us. So the level of lack of knowledge is horrible, critical. But on the other hand, many people here, and also you mentioned education as a panacea for all kinds of trouble. Well, I'm more skeptical about this. We don't see it actually, and we have a very in-depth analysis of partisanship versus knowledge about reality, and partisanship beats by far. If you are a devoted partisan, you know, we asked in, I'm sorry, do we have time? One example. in 2010, we asked, this was about knowledge and about asking Polish citizens whether it's true about certain facts, objective facts. So one of the probably most visible objective facts and propaganda fact was that in 2008 Poland was in 2009 Poland was the green island of Europe. We had the only country in Europe, which was true. GDP growth of 1.7, whereas all other countries around us has -5, -10, you name it, right? And we asked Polish citizens in 2010, is it true that in 2009 Poland was this bloody green island? 67% of oppositional party at that time, PiS supporters, say no. No way we had this kind of growth. And this also goes to you about knowledge, etc. But you know, and of course there were other questions which indicate that also electorate of Platforma, the more educated, are also, when the partisanship is strong, forget the facts. The facts don't work. And the most astonishing, however, and here I stop, is that we thought that these who are prone to, who are victims of propaganda, of partisanship and manipulation, are those of lower education. Not true. If partisanship is strong, the highly educated are even worse. And when we try to put a hand on it, what happens that those educated people are so eager to confirm false statements? Probably the answer is, you know, they read too much. And they have, whenever there is a lie or propaganda thing, they can quote something that is along the lines of this kind of... So the like-minded people and those who take the knowledge, I think I don't have time because I wanted to react also to the other thing, that probably what I see in the Polish National Election Survey and many other things, that what happens between politics, parties and citizens is so much dependent. I was unaware for that for many, many years. It depends very much on mesostructures and intermediary social institutions. And you know, Orban was right that he was investing in football clubs and all these things, because this is where life is, right? And this it's also Aiken and Bartel's 2017 Democracy for Realists, right? Where they self-criticize, they breastbeat themselves and they say, well, we were wrong about this individual reductionism. I'm sorry, I'm too talkative.
We still have time, don't worry, so we still have 30 minutes. Please, Chris?
Yeah, thank you, David, for the question. Complex question, actually. Let me start like this. When Radek reported about this maximalist understanding of democracy that we find more in Eastern Europe. So it's liberal as well as in other countries, done add on, and then gets a very expansive understanding of what democracy should do. It reminds me very much on the time of my PhD thesis, where I analyzed data. It was the first German, after reunification, the first German East-West elite survey paralleled by a population survey. And I was comparing in my dissertation, among other things, the different understandings. At this time we talked not so much about democracy, but about the state. And it turned out Eastern Germans, both elite level and citizen level, had a much more expansive understanding of the state in terms of what deliverables you expect to be provided. Of course, a socialist legacy. No question. The interesting thing was, then I was in the next step looking if the numbers that distinguished West from Eastern Germany are the same when we compare Western and Eastern Europe in general. And it was a mirror image of this comparison. And probably we see this still reflected in those numbers. And you might be surprised that, for instance, then in Scandinavian countries, the redistributive welfare state notion is not so established as we might think. I think this is because Western Europe had a longer time to socialize and mature into a more sophisticated understanding of the concept. I think Western Europeans understand better that democracy is defined by input structures. How many institutional channels of voice and vote and influence you give to the citizen. It's not about output legitimacy, even though some scholars of the European Union try to tell us once in a while that the European Union does not have a democracy deficit because it delivers. Delivery is not the definition of democracy. The state might perform well in economic growth and prosperity, in peace and security, or not. Whether it is the case or not is not a definition of democracy. Democracy is defined by the participatory mechanisms and checks and balances. And I think what we see in Eastern Europe is that people project of what they expect from the state into their definition of democracy, and this is one of the reasons why it gets so maximalist. With the low cognition need, that finding in this Ford and Trump book was very clear that the Trump voters very substantially differ from the other half of the electorate in having significantly lower cognition needs. They also have significantly lower emphasis on emancipative values, so progressive liberal values. So those two things go closely together, for which reason there is an intricate relationship. According to our analysis, emancipative values start to surface and to flourish when people go through a process of what I call cognitive mobilization. And that means, basically speaking, education is a key part of it for sure, but it's not the only. It also depends a little bit what you do in your occupation, if you are exposed to abstract concepts, knowledge, complex thinking, analytical skills, communicational skills, and so on and so forth. What these processes do, no matter what subject area, they make people learn to think for themselves. And when this is the case, people no longer want to be told what to do and what to believe. And that's the moment where emancipative values kick in naturally. You don't need an educational program in order to bring this into people's mindset. It comes in naturally once you have learned to think for yourself. Now, because emancipative values are a product of processes of cognitive mobilization, they come in turn with a high cognition need. And we see this also very clearly in the World Value Survey data, where we also have a battery of meanings of understanding questions that the respondents should answer. What we do a bit differently from the ESS has a whole list of things like multi-party system, press freedom, and so on, that from a textbook definition of political science we would put anyways into the item battery. What we did differently, we put items in there that are an outright contradiction of democracy in order to see whether people support this. And you go to Iraq or to Egypt, and then you find 80% of the electorate that says, yes, I agree on a scale from 1 to 10 at 0.9 or 8, that democracy means that the military takes over when the civilian government is incompetent. The same 80% also say, yes, democracy means that the religious leaders ultimately interpret the law. And then you go to Egypt, and first you get Morsi, and then you get Sisi.
It's 40% in Hungary.
Yeah, so you get this oxymoron, which seems to be a contradiction in adjective, that you have authoritarian understandings of democracy. And they are quite widespread, especially outside classic Western post-industrial mature democracies. This is quite widespread. Contrary to a paper that was just published in Science by the Oxford Center of Democratic Resilience, where they claim that the understanding of democracy is the same everywhere in the world. It's flatly in contradiction to our published papers. Anyway, so if you look what makes people most immune against these misunderstandings of democracy, and also against over-assessing, again, another cognitive process, going back to Pippa. We have this question where we ask people, how democratic is your country on a scale from 1 to 10? And then you can match this with VDEM data. How much do people overestimate? You go to China, to Vietnam, 80% of the electorate says their country is very democratic, 8, 9, or 10. Match this on VDEM, and VDEM says it's not a democracy. So you get overestimations, and you can measure them to what extent they exist. You also get underestimations. So this is another kind of yardstick exercise to judge how accurate people are in their perception of the political world. And in both of these instances, understandings of democracy and assessments of democracy, emancipative values are the strongest driver to the positive.
Thank you. There's a question of Pippa to Chris. Is Pippa still online? Yes, Pippa wants to give a question to you, Chris. Okay.
Yes, by all means, Christian. Did you want to talk about it, or?
No, I think you had a question to Chris Wenzel.
Okay, so what I was arguing was, obviously, Chris, I think absolutely that there are both positive and negative forms of trust. That's absolutely right. But I think we need to think about this from two perspectives. One is the agent, i.e. the citizen, and one is the principal, i.e. the government. And from the government's perspective, trust is always great, because trust is basically meaning that there should be compliance with a legitimate authority. So in that sense, I'm arguing, or one could think that what it does is basically, particularly in authoritarian regimes, they want the citizens to trust them because it lowers the barriers, it increases their power and their authority. But for principles, i.e. the citizen, trust is both positive and negative. So just to qualify what you were arguing in your opening remarks, there are both versions, but again, from whose perspective are we looking at this? I wondered, how would you respond to that idea?
Thank you, Pippa. Chris?
Thank you. I wouldn't agree more with you, because I would actually argue, we did run some models, that in an authoritarian system, if you want to let C evolve a critical citizenry that might have the potential for democratizing pressures for regime change to the better, from our eyes, I would expect them to be distrustful for sure. So this is the constellation where, from a democratization perspective, in authoritarian systems, we would like to see citizens distrust. We know very well, however, that in many dictatorships we have outrageously high trust figures. The problem is it's not so clear how to interpret this. It could be that because of censorship and propaganda and indoctrination really works, so it means these people really think what they say in the surveys. But it could also be that the people do not unclose what they really think of the regime and are much more critical than what we get out of the survey data. This would be Timur Kuran's phenomenon that he described in one of his books as public lies and private truths. The subtitle was the consequences of preference falsification. We do not exactly know this, even though we made a big step in the World Value Survey with the survey experiment that basically Pippa has designed, where we confront people in two different settings with two different sets of rulers. One of them, in one treatment, the ruler of their own country is included, in the other it is excluded, and that is one way in this direction.
Thank you, Chris. Pippa, you want to say something?
I absolutely agree. And of course, we have the new data. The experiment was replicated in our new survey as well. And so we can actually look at that. But preference falsification, of course, is not just about democracy. It's about any sensitive topic. And things as basic as, did you vote? You get preference falsification. 10% or so people say they did vote when they didn't. So it's a basic flaw in our survey assumptions that we just take things at face value, whereas in fact the citizens might have a variety of other messages which they're sending when they respond to survey data. It's a really complicated issue.
Thank you, Pippa. So we are almost coming to a close. Are there any comments? Last minute? We still have a few minutes. Please.
I wanted to add something about education, because I think it's really important. I mean, you've been discussing about that, and I fully agree about what we said about cognitive mobilization. And as a European studies person, I've been, reading that a lot and studying that a lot. And in fact, but we should be careful saying that cognitive mobilization may bring trust in good democratic governance, because in fact this belief was really the belief of that people studying European Union had, following in a way wrongly Engelhardt, but they really, they put that in the idea into the Commission, and for years we thought, they thought. Everything is going to be right because people will be more and more educated, and they will be both so educated, meaning they will know a lot, and they will be critical, and at some point it will bring support for the European Union, which it didn't. And I think you're a bit hard on people saying, democracy is people studying democracy at the European level say it might just come from the outputs. They say the European Union might gain support by outputs, saying that they will say they are supporters of European. They believe it's democratic because the output is not exactly what is in this literature. But anyway, I think we have a responsibility as well about education, because if we say, as you say, we did something on a level of knowledge, and we can't say the results because people are just, it's what we learn. It's really bad because, they don't know a lot. And I remember doing my PhD on the European Union. I interviewed a woman, and she told me that Japan was part of the European Union. And basically, when you hear that, you just think, all right, okay, what can I do with it? I am just stupid to study what these people think, because basically, what can I do with it? But then you go further on, and you understand that from her, coming from, she was from Moroccan origin, living in a suburb in France, north of France, this suburb where they vote a lot for the National Front. For her, she was saying something about Europe is the wealthy. Europe is the wealthy, just taking care of the wealthy. And then it was explaining her distrust for the European Union. And so I think we need to understand that. We need to go at this level of understanding, not just what knowledge do they have, but what perception do they have to really understand where is the question of trust, how to understand the question of trust and distrust.
Thank you. So, please.
Yes, just a short comment, two issues. The first one is that I would like to reflect what Radek said. I strongly support the idea that whenever the political chaos is increasing, then those partisan-oriented diffusion of informations are on the way. We see that in France in this Sevipov survey. And the second issue is the question of the synthetic piece of information. So studies on that are yet to come, and probably the acknowledgement of AI-driven issues are much more welcome by random citizens than we could expect.
Professor Gadowski?
Well, my final remark is that I am very much afraid that all this will become very, very messy soon. Yeah? And I'm happy that I will be exiting soon from the research, not generally, but from the research of public attitudes in the foreseeable future, because It really, you were lucky, by the way, that I was given only 15 minutes, because had I had an hour, I would have created such a mess with the results I have, because between the two of us, let's put it this way, I'm involved in many projects, you know, and really I look for consistency across projects, and I tend not to say a word about reality unless I see the same result everywhere. Unfortunately, I don't see it. And this is not, well, part of the story might be that it's a methodological noise. But certainly the other thing is, simply put, I mean, there are different results, and I don't know why. You know? Okay, you might be more lucky with the World Value Survey, but you know, these two books, we were discussing it hours and hours, what is wrong. All of a sudden, in the second round, Portugal looks completely different than 10 years ago, and nobody, even the Portuguese, if Pedro Magalhães is not capable of to tell you what is going on in the Portuguese sample, then, you know, I mean, and on top of that, we didn't mention this artificial intelligence is going to be an enormous variable very soon. I'm afraid that we have to find some solution, at least minimal solution to that problem of, you know, just final thing. Only recently I recognized that some 2 centuries, century plus ago, on this planet, there was 1 billion people, and probably 50,000 were talking and writing, right? Currently, there are 8 billion, and 7 billion are talking and writing. I mean, you cannot make sense of what is going on. I mean, I'm just lost. Maybe it's me. I hope it's only me. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe the solution comes from France. Frédéric Gauthier, the leader of the French team, wants to give a statement. Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sorry again, guys, for not being there. I had one, to wrap it up, one easy question for each panelist. I mean, easy question because it's a normative one, and scholars are usually comfortable giving normative recommendations. So the question would be this one: if political actors took your research seriously, what should they do differently tomorrow morning or on Monday morning to rebuild trust?
So the question is to the whole panel. Yeah.
One short takeaway from all panelists, if feasible. If not, you can simply close the floor.
That's a very good idea at the end of a panel. They will respond by email to you.
With that.
Yeah, Frédéric, thank you very much for this message, which was consistent with Radek's assessment of slightly diffuse situation. I would like to thank the audience for the patience, and I would like to thank you all for staying the whole day, and I would like to thank all the panelists for their fascinating and a bit disturbing but very interesting statements. The day is closed, and thank you for this event, and it will be available later on YouTube, and you can watch yourself on YouTube later on. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
And thanks to Christian and Kessina for everything. It's really been great.